The second attempt to change the Canadian sort of constitution after 1982 comes in 1992. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Charlottetown Accords in this sort of process. So in some ways, by 1992, the population of Quebec is getting kind of grumpy because from their perspective, they've sent a really clear signal to the rest of Canada that the existing constitution is a problem, and they're kind of pissed off that the rest of Canada didn't think that was important enough to pass the Meech Lake Accords the first time around. So you get a sort of rise in nationalist sentiment going through the early 1990s, which is one of the motivators for the Charlottetown Accords in 1992. And again, there's an attempt within those accords to sort of talk about limiting the federal government's ability to spend in provincial jurisdictions. It also attempts to fix the problem with the Meech Lake Accord, which is to say it consults Indigenous leaders in the first place, and it also addresses this conversation around Indigenous self-governance, and there is sort of an attempt to sort of talk about, well, hey, wait a minute, if we have to fix the place of Quebec within our constitution, we also have to fix the place of Indigenous populations, Indigenous people within the Constitution, and that's kind of important. So there's an attempt to resolve that within the Charlottetown Accords. It also attempts to fix the problems with the Senate. So if you've heard the phrase of a triple E Senate, which is sort of more common in Alberta than it is elsewhere, because it is an idea that originates here in Alberta through the Calgary School of Political Science, which winds up creating the Reform Party later on. But for right now, triple E Senate. And for those of you who do not know this, the Triple E Senate is, the E's in that are equal, elected, and effective. So those are basically the three main criticisms, I guess, of the Canadian Senate. That it's not equal, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier on in this unit, that sort of the Maritimes, Quebec, and Ontario are vastly overrepresented, and there's no way, for example, for an Alberta senator to sort of come in and say, this is going to be really good for Alberta if Quebec, and have that pass, even if Quebec is like, yeah, no, we just don't like it. Not necessarily it is directly counter to our interests, but we just don't like it. We don't want to. So there's that kind of challenge about equal. We've sort of talked about, a lot of my students come in with this idea that the Senate is useless and it doesn't do much of anything. So there's a conversation about effective in that, in terms of giving the Senate actual responsibilities and sort of talking about what the Senate is supposed to do and how it is supposed to serve Canadians. There's that sort of piece. And then also elected, a sort of an idea that it makes more sense to elect senators. This is still a bit of a hybrid in terms of what we have now and, for example, what the United States has, because the idea is that when a Senate seat became vacant, right, as a senator retired, also part of this process is about insisting on retirement ages and that kind of thing, but when a senator retired, then the people living in the province in question would have an election and sort of sit in that sort of would elect a new person to fill that space. Alberta actually did hold senator elections for a while, with the understanding that they held elections, and then when it came up, the provincial government would be recommending the winners of said elections to the federal government, but they were never binding, and that's sort of a possibility. Instead of trying to pass this through the legislatures, because that was sort of part of the issue, right? When we sort of start talking about both the changes of government sort of reversing that result in the Maritimes, and then that single vote around a public consultation process, in an attempt to avoid the sort of bureaucratic pieces and the weird vagrancies of the electoral policy system in Canada, the decision is made to attempt to pass the Charlottetown Accords through a nationwide referendum. Because you can ensure that you get at least that you can get a majority in 7 provinces, and that you get at least 50% of the population if you're no, literally, we just asked the population to vote. So that was sort of the attempt. And I need to talk about how this goes over. And the end result is not very well. Not very well. But I want you guys to understand that that's not necessarily about people being strongly opposed to the measures that are in the Charlottetown Accords. In a lot of ways, this is the result of a failure of what we would refer to in political science as political capital. Um, and we could talk a lot about what that means sort of more broadly, but basically, there's no charter, and it's really hard to make people care about this thing. When you are looking at addressing the place of Quebec in Canada and Indigenous self-government and changes to and limiting the federal government spending in provincial jurisdictions and creating changes to allow for for unelected equal and effective Senate, like that means that this referendum question becomes a really unwieldy document. And it required a lot of time and a lot of effort to understand well. And it sort of basically takes this really long document that most people don't fully understand because they're not constitutional scholars and asks them to turn it down into a yes-no question. And I will also say that Mulroney is less charismatic than Trudeau is, and he is less able to make Canadians care about these issues and to sort of be convinced that this is an important way for the government to be spending their time, that this is an important thing to resolve, that sort of the position of Quebec and Canada is really important and other Canadians should care about it and they should sort of invest the time to do this sort of thing. Especially because this is the third time in a decade that the Canadian population has had to hear about and deal with a political news cycle and a whole bunch of political time and energy being spent on the Constitution. Especially since they went, as far as many of them are concerned, dude, we managed quite nicely for 50 years without ever talking about this. I'm done. I don't want to talk about this anymore. And in a lot of ways, the Charlottetown Accords are sort of perceived, that sort of second attempt to change the Canadian Constitution is perceived as one of the things that sort of kills Brian Mulroney's political career, because he becomes sort of a lot more unpopular because he keeps pushing people to try to care about something they really don't care about, and the population doesn't like it. So since that point in time, right, we repatriate the Constitution in 1982. There's an attempt to change it in 1987. There's an attempt to change it in 1992. And since then, nothing. Nothing. No political party has seriously stood up and said, you know what we need to do? Change the Constitution. And there's an understanding kind of in Canadian political circles that that's just not something you talk about. That like, yeah, we recognize those are issues, but we can't deal with them because the phrase that a lot of my more politically inclined friends use is, oh, because they're political kryptonite. Because if you try it, you're going to end your career. Because you can't actually make the changes that are necessary, and if you try, your voters are going to hate you, and you're going to lose your job. That doesn't go over well in some communities, because that reluctance of major political parties to sort of even address these issues can be perceived by other portions of the population, specifically portions of the population whose needs are not met in the 1982 Constitution, i.e. the nationalist population, the nationalist sort of sentiment out of Quebec, the ideas about self-governance and sort of how we integrate and how the Crown relates to Indigenous people needs to be sorted out. And so for these communities, for Francophones, for Indigenous populations, for the Métis, who are sort of both, but not quite, sort of occupy their own space, the failure of the Charlottetown Accords and the sort of attending, we're not touching this, for the 30 years following, in a lot of ways is a communication to those groups that the rest of Canada just doesn't care about their issues and is never really going to address them. And that makes this sort of becomes a watershed moment where ideas shift a little bit about, for example, whether it is possible for the Indigenous population of Canada to work with the Crown and work with other Canadians to create the necessary changes, or is it necessary to sort of work against the crown. And there's a shift because of that sort of process. You get a similar sentiment among the nationalist population of Quebec, which is a sort of massive driver of the second Quebec referendum in 1995, because the nationalists in Quebec are kind of driven by that idea of like, listen, we tried it your way twice. We tried to change and to sort of address our issues with the Canadian Constitution through Meech Lake. We tried through Charlottetown. The rest of Canada won't go along with it. We need to leave. And that sort of sentiment is pretty strong. But it is also really important to understand that, like, for most Canadian politicians now, although many of them will be like, yes, that is an ongoing constitutional issue, actually making changes is a kind of political live wire, and they just won't touch it because it doesn't make sense for them to do so, because it sort of will cost them their careers. So that's a rough, I guess, introduction of how our Canadian Constitution is working right now, and we'll sort of move into more contemporary stuff as we go forward.